I never thought my own daughter would tell me I didn't deserve a place at the table. There I was, sitting in the elegant dining room of Maison Blanche, watching Delilah move gracefully between tables in her chef's whites, pride swelling in my chest despite our strained relationship. I'd raised this brilliant woman, sacrificed my dreams so she could chase hers. When she finally approached our table, I expected maybe a smile, perhaps even a brief conversation. Instead, she looked me dead in the eyes and said those words that would change everything. "You don't deserve a place at this table, Mama. You never fought for anything in your life." The humiliation burned through me like fire. But what would you do if your child stripped away your dignity in front of strangers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I suppose I should start from the beginning, back when life made sense and my place in the world felt secure. My name is Evelyn May Carter, and until 3 weeks ago I was a retired high school English teacher, living quietly in a Victorian house on Bull Street in Savannah's historic district. The house, with its wraparound porch and Spanish moss, draped live oaks, had been my sanctuary for 37 years. Every morning I'd sit on that porch with my coffee, watching the city wake up, while Franklin's reading glasses caught the early sunlight from where they still rested on the side table. Those glasses, I couldn't bring myself to move them, even 5 years after Franklin's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in March. They were wire-rimmed, slightly bent at the bridge where he'd pushed them up his nose countless times while grading papers or reading his beloved Civil War histories. Sometimes I'd catch myself reaching for them, thinking I heard his voice calling from the study, asking where I'd put his red pen or whether I thought we should try that new restaurant downtown. Franklin Carter had been my husband for 32 years, and in many ways, he'd been my entire world. We met at the University of Georgia when I was 22, and he was 25, both of us, earnest young academics who believed in the power of education to change lives. He was pursuing his doctorate in American history, while I was finishing my master's in English literature. I remember the first time I saw him in the graduate library, hunched over a stack of books about Reconstruction, his dark hair falling across his forehead, as he scribbled notes in that careful handwriting I'd come to know so well. Our courtship was gentle and scholarly. We'd meet for coffee between classes, discussing everything from Faulkner to the changing, south to our dreams of making a difference in young people's lives. Franklin wanted to teach at the university level, maybe write the definitive book on Georgia during the Civil War. I had different dreams then, quieter ones, but dreams nonetheless. I wanted to open a little cafe, maybe near the college where students and professors could gather over good food and great conversation. I even had a name picked out, the Reading Room. But life has a way of reshaping our dreams, doesn't it? By the time we married in 1987, Franklin had already been diagnosed with the heart condition that would shadow our entire marriage. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, the doctors assured us, but it meant stress needed to be managed carefully. Heavy physical work was out. Long hours were discouraged. The dream of opening a cafe, with its demanding schedule and physical requirements, quietly slipped away. I told myself it didn't matter. Franklin needed stability, and teaching high, school English would provide that steady income and reliable schedule. We bought the house on Bull Street with money from my grandmother's estate, and I threw myself into creating a home that would be Franklin's refuge from the world. I learned to cook his favorite meals, tended a garden that bloomed year-round, and made sure his study was always stocked with the books and supplies he needed for his research. The years passed in a comfortable rhythm. Franklin taught history at the local high school while working on his book in the evenings. I taught English to generations of teenagers, many of whom still send me Christmas cards with updates about their lives. We tried for children for several years before Delilah came along when I was 31. She was our miracle baby, beautiful and fierce from the moment she drew breath. Franklin adored her with a quiet intensity that sometimes surprised me. This man who was so reserved in most aspects of life would spend hours reading to Delilah, teaching her chess, helping her with school projects that went far beyond what any elementary student needed to submit. I was the one who handled the day-to-day parenting, the doctor's appointments, the school conferences, the teenage drama, while Franklin provided the intellectual stimulation and unconditional approval that every child craves. Maybe that's where things started to go wrong between Delilah and me, though I didn't see it at the time. She grew up seeing her father as the gentle professor who believed in her dreams, while I was the practical one who insisted on chores and homework and reasonable bedtimes. When she announced at 16 that she wanted to attend culinary school instead of college, Franklin was immediately supportive. "Follow your passion," he told her, his eyes lighting up behind those wire-rimmed glasses. "Life's too short to do work that doesn't feed your soul." I was the one who worried about practical things. Culinary school was expensive, and the restaurant industry was notoriously difficult, especially for women. Wouldn't it be wiser to get a traditional degree first, maybe in business, and then pursue cooking as a hobby or side career? My concerns came from love and experience, but I can see now how they must have sounded to a passionate teenager. I was the dream crusher, the voice of limitation, while her father was the encourager. The irony wasn't lost on me, even then. Here I was, discouraging my daughter from pursuing a career in food service when I'd once dreamed of opening my own cafe. But my dreams had been different somehow. Smaller, more focused on community and conversation than the high-pressure, high-stakes world Delilah was determined to enter. And by then, my own dreams felt like stories from another lifetime, too, faded and impractical to mention. Delilah did go to culinary school, of course. She was talented and determined, qualities she'd inherited from both sides of the family. She started at small restaurants in Atlanta, working her way up through sheer skill and stubborn persistence. Franklin and I were proud, even when months would pass between phone calls and her visits home, became increasingly brief and stilted. The distance between us grew wider after Franklin's death. I'd expected grief to bring us closer, to create space for the kind of honest conversations we'd never quite managed when he was alive. Instead, Delilah seemed to blame me for everything. For Franklin's death, for the years of caution and compromise, for being the kind of woman who'd shaped her life around other people's needs, instead of her own ambitions. "You never fought for anything, Mama," she'd said during one of our last real conversations, about 2 years ago. "Daddy died believing you were happy, but I could see it. You gave up everything you wanted. And for what? To prove you were a good wife? A good mother? Well, congratulations. You were so good at taking care of everyone else that none of us ever learned to take care of you." I'd tried to explain that caring for the people you love isn't giving up. It's choosing what matters most. But Delilah had already decided who I was in her story. The woman who settled, who sacrificed, who never demanded more from life because she didn't believe she deserved it. After Franklin's funeral, our relationship became a careful dance of avoidance, punctuated by dutiful holiday phone calls and birthday cards with generic messages. She'd moved to Savannah 2 years ago to work at Maison Blanche, one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. But we saw each other maybe 3 times in those 24 months. Each encounter was polite but cold, like interactions between distant acquaintances rather than mother and daughter. That's what made last week's dinner invitation so surprising. Delilah called on a Tuesday evening, her voice carefully neutral, but not unfriendly. "I thought maybe we could have dinner," she said. "At the restaurant. Saturday at 7? I should have been suspicious of the sudden overture. But hope is a stubborn thing. Maybe she was ready to bridge the gap between us. Maybe she wanted to show off her work, to let me see the world she'd built for herself. I spent the week choosing what to wear, imagining conversations we might have, wondering if this could be the beginning of something new between us. I arrived at Maison Blanche 15 minutes early, nervous and excited in equal measure. The restaurant was everything I'd expected. Elegant without being pretentious, with warm lighting, and the kind of understated luxury that makes you feel special just for being there. The hostess seated me at a table with a perfect view of the open kitchen, where I could watch Delilah work. She was magnificent, I had to admit, confident and precise, moving through the chaos of a busy kitchen like a conductor leading an orchestra. The respect of her colleagues was obvious in how they responded to her quiet directions, the way they stepped aside when she needed to reach something, the small nods of approval when she tasted and adjusted their dishes. I sat there for 20 minutes, nursing a glass of wine and watching my daughter work, feeling that familiar mixture of pride and regret that had defined our relationship for so many years. When she finally emerged from the kitchen and walked toward my table, I felt my heart race with anticipation. That's when she delivered the blow that changed everything. Not just the words, "You don't deserve a place at this table," but the way she said them, cold and final, as if she'd been planning this moment for months. The humiliation was complete, witnessed by other diners who pretended not to stare while I gathered my purse and coat and walked out with as much dignity as I could manage. I drove home in a daze, Franklin's reading glasses the first thing I saw when I walked through the front door. They seemed to catch the lamplight accusingly, as if even he was disappointed in the woman I'd become. That night, I sat on our bed, my bed now, and held those glasses while I cried tears I hadn't shed since his funeral. But somewhere between the tears and the sleepless dawn that followed, something shifted. Delilah was right about one thing. I had never fought for anything in my life. I'd accepted, adapted, accommodated. I'd been so busy being good that I'd forgotten how to be strong. Maybe it was time to change that. The idea came to me at 3, in the morning, the way life-changing decisions often do. Sudden and clear as lightning against a dark sky. I was sitting in Franklin's study, still wearing the dress I'd worn to dinner, surrounded by his books and papers that I'd never had the heart to pack away. His reading glasses were in my hands, and I was thinking about all the things I'd never done, never tried, never even considered because they seemed too bold, too risky, too much. That's when I remembered something Franklin had told me years ago, back when we were newlyweds and still sharing our deepest dreams with each other. We'd been walking through downtown Savannah, past all the beautiful old buildings, and I'd mentioned my cafe idea. He'd stopped right there on the sidewalk and taken my hands. "Evelyn," he'd said, his eyes serious behind those glasses. "Promise me something. If anything ever happens to me, if you ever get the chance to chase that dream, you'll take it. Don't let fear or propriety or what other people think stop you from becoming who you're meant to be." I'd laughed it off at the time, kissed him and told him nothing was going to happen to him, that we had decades ahead of us to figure things out. But now, sitting in his empty study with his glasses growing warm in my palms, I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were standing right behind me. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was going to buy Maison Blanche, The idea was so audacious it made me laugh out loud, startling the neighbor's cat, who'd been prowling around my garden. Me, Evelyn May Carter, retired English teacher and professional people-pleaser, buying one of Savannah's most successful restaurants. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was exactly the kind of impulsive, dramatic gesture I'd spent my entire life avoiding. Which was precisely why I had to do it. I spent the morning researching, something I'd learned to do thoroughly during my teaching years. Maison Blanche was owned by a restaurant group based in Atlanta. They had several properties, but this one had been struggling lately. Not with quality, which remained excellent, but with the financial pressures that were affecting restaurants everywhere. Higher food costs, labor shortages, the lingering effects of the pandemic. According to the business journals I found online, they were quietly exploring their options. The next step was figuring out if I could actually afford such a venture. Franklin had been careful with money, and his life insurance policy was substantial. Combined with my teacher's pension, my own savings, and the equity in our house, I had more resources than I'd ever really considered. We'd lived modestly, saved, diligently, and never had expensive tastes. All those years of careful financial planning had left me with options I'd never imagined. By Tuesday, I had the name of the right attorney. By Wednesday, I'd met with my financial advisor and discovered that, yes, with proper planning and perhaps a small business loan, purchasing a restaurant was within the realm of possibility. By Thursday, I'd contacted the Atlanta restaurant group and expressed my interest. The phone call to their corporate office was terrifying. My hands shook as I dialed, and I had to clear my throat twice before I could speak clearly. But I'd spent 35 years facing down teenagers who thought they knew better than their teachers. I could handle a conversation with restaurant executives. Maison Blanche, Savannah, I said when the receptionist answered. I understand you might be considering selling the property. I'd like to discuss making an offer. The pause on the other end of the line stretched so long, I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Finally, a man's voice came back, cautious but interested. May I ask who's calling? Evelyn Carter, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I'm a local resident with serious interest in the property. What followed was a series of meetings that felt like elaborate theater. I met with lawyers, accountants, restaurant consultants, and finally the executives themselves. They were polite but skeptical. A 62-year-old retired teacher didn't fit their usual buyer profile. But my financial credentials were solid, my references impeccable, and most importantly, I was offering to pay cash with a substantial down payment. The due diligence process took 2 weeks. I toured the restaurant after hours, walking through the dining room where Delilah had humiliated me, examining the kitchen where she created her culinary magic, meeting with the staff to understand the operation. The manager, Marcos Delgado, was professional but wary during our initial meeting. Ma'am, he said, his slight Spanish accent coloring the words. I have to ask, what exactly are your plans for this place? Because we've got a good team here, people who depend on these jobs. And we've heard rumors about potential buyers who want to completely change the concept. I liked him immediately. He was probably in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of calm competence that comes from years of managing high-pressure situations. More importantly, he was asking the right questions, putting his staff's welfare ahead of his own job security. I'm not interested in changing what works, I told him honestly. I want to learn the business, understand how to make it even better. I'm hoping the current staff will be willing to teach me. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. And what about Delilah? She's one of our best sous chefs. This could be complicated. That was the understatement of the century. I hadn't spoken to Delilah since that awful dinner, hadn't even told her what I was planning. Part of me knew I was being petty, getting my revenge in the most dramatic way possible. But a larger part of me genuinely believed this could be something more than revenge, maybe even a bridge back to each other. "I'll handle Delilah," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. On a rainy Friday afternoon in October, I signed the papers that made me the official owner of Maison Blanche. The deed was a thick document full of legal language, but seeing my name on it, Evelyn May Carter, owner, gave me a rush of excitement and terror unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Franklin's reading glasses were in my purse, and I touched them for luck as I signed each page. The Atlanta group insisted on a transition period where they'd help me understand the operational aspects of the business. They were clearly relieved to have found a buyer who wasn't planning to gut the place and turn it into a chain restaurant or sports bar. I agreed to keep all current staff for at least 90 days, with the understanding that employment decisions after that would be based on performance and mutual fit. Walking out of that lawyer's office with the deed in my hand, I felt like I'd stepped into someone else's life. This wasn't something Evelyn Carter did. This was bold and risky and completely outside my comfort zone. But maybe that was exactly the point. I drove straight to my sister Gwen's house in Charleston, needing to tell someone what I'd done before I lost my nerve. Gwen was in her garden when I arrived, pulling weeds with the focused intensity she brought to everything in life. At 70, she was still fierce and independent, the kind of woman who'd never let anyone else define her limits. "Evelyn!" she called when she saw me walking up her driveway. "What brings you down here on a Friday afternoon? You look like you've either won the lottery or committed a crime." I held up the deed, my hands trembling slightly. "I bought a restaurant." Gwen dropped her gardening gloves and stared at me for a long moment. Then she threw back her head and laughed, a deep, delighted sound that seemed to come from her toes. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Evelyn May Carter, restaurant owner. Franklin always said you had more steel in your spine than you let people see. I think he'd be proud as punch." That night, over wine and takeout Chinese food, I told Gwen the whole story. The dinner, the humiliation, the sleepless night with Franklin's glasses, the impulsive decision that had led to this moment. She listened without judgment, nodding, occasionally asking practical questions about financing and staffing and my complete lack of restaurant experience. "So what's your plan?" she asked finally. I took a deep breath, tasting the uncertainty and excitement in equal measure. "I have no idea," I admitted. "I guess I'm going to learn as I go." Gwen raised her wine glass in a toast. "Here's to learning as you go," she said, "and to finally giving that daughter of yours something real to be proud of." On Monday morning, I would walk into Maison Blanche as its owner. Delilah would be there, and I had no idea how she would react to discovering that the woman she'd dismissed as too weak to deserve a place at the table had bought the entire restaurant. But for now, sitting in my sister's kitchen with the deed spread out on the table between us, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The thrilling, terrifying possibility of becoming someone entirely new. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes Savannah feel almost like autumn. I stood outside Maison Blanche at 7:30, clutching my leather teaching satchel, the same one I'd carried to school for 15 years, and trying to summon the courage to walk through the front door as the owner rather than a humiliated dinner guest. Inside my satchel, along with Franklin's reading glasses, was the small notebook I'd kept throughout my teaching career. It was filled with observations about human nature, lessons learned from working with teenagers, strategies for handling difficult personalities and tense situations. Last night I'd written a new entry. Day 1. Remember that respect is earned through actions, not titles. Listen more than you speak. Everyone has something to teach you. The morning staff was already inside, preparing for the lunch service. I could see movement through the windows, servers setting tables, kitchen staff beginning their mise en place, the familiar choreography of a restaurant coming to life. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door and stepped into my new reality. Marcos was behind the bar, reviewing what looked like inventory sheets. He glanced up when he heard the door, and I watched recognition dawn in his dark eyes. Word had traveled fast, apparently. Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I heard congratulations are in order. Thank you, I replied, walking toward him with more confidence than I felt. I was hoping we could talk about the transition, about what I need to learn, about how we can make this work for everyone. He set down his clipboard and really looked at me then, perhaps seeing something in my face that surprised him. The wariness was still there, but there was curiosity too. Coffee, he offered, gesturing toward the bar. It's going to be a long conversation. As he poured 2 cups from the machine behind the bar, I settled onto one of the high stools and pulled out my notebook. The action was automatic, born of decades of preparing for important discussions, but I saw him notice it. You always take notes? He asked, sliding a cup toward me. Old habit. 35 years of teaching teenagers taught me that if you don't write it down, you'll forget the important parts. I opened to a fresh page. So tell me what I need to know. What followed was a crash course in restaurant operations that made my head spin. Marcos walked me through everything from food costs and labor percentages to health department regulations and vendor relationships. He showed me how to read the daily sales reports, explained the delicate balance of scheduling staff to match expected business levels, and outlined the dozens of small decisions that had to be made every day to keep a restaurant running smoothly. The margins are tight, he explained, pulling out a folder of financial reports. Food costs should ideally run around 30% of sales, labor around 35%. Add in rent, utilities, insurance, supplies, and you're looking at maybe 5 to 10% profit on a good month. One bad week can wipe out a month's earnings. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I scribbled notes furiously, trying to absorb the complexity of what I'd undertaken. In my teaching world, success was measured in test scores and graduation rates, metrics that developed over months and years. Here, success or failure was tallied every single day. What about the staff? I asked. What do I need to know about managing them? Marcos's expression softened slightly. They're good people, Mrs. Carter. Most of them have been here for years. They work hard because they take pride in what we do here. But they're also protective of each other and suspicious of change. They've seen owners come and go, seen restaurants fail because new management didn't understand the business. And Delilah? The question hung in the air between us. Marcos took a long sip of his coffee before answering. Delilah is complicated. She's talented, maybe the most naturally gifted cook I've worked with in 20 years. But she's also carrying some heavy emotional baggage. The kitchen is where she feels safe, where she has control. This situation, her mother buying the restaurant, it's gonna shake her world pretty hard. As if summoned by our conversation, the kitchen door swung open and Delilah emerged, wearing her chef's whites and carrying a clipboard. She was focused on whatever she was reading and didn't notice me at first. When she looked up and saw me, sitting at the bar with Marcos, her face went through a series of expressions. Confusion, recognition, and finally, a kind of stunned disbelief. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. I'd rehearsed this moment in my mind, but sitting there under her intense stare, all my prepared words evaporated. Instead, I found myself responding with the simple truth. "I work here now," I said quietly. "I bought the restaurant." The silence that followed was deafening. Delilah stared at me as if I'd announced I was planning to fly to the moon. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. "You bought it?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." I kept my tone calm, professional, the same voice I'd used to handle classroom crises. "I know this is a shock, but I hope we can find a way to work together, professionally." Delilah's shock was rapidly transforming into something else. Anger, maybe, or hurt, or some complicated mixture of both. Her cheeks flushed red, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This is because of what I said," she accused. "You bought my restaurant because you wanted to get back at me." "It's not your restaurant," I said, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. "And this isn't about revenge. This is about me finally doing something for myself." "Something for yourself?" Her voice rose, and I was aware of other staff members glancing over from their prep work. "You don't know anything about restaurants. You don't know anything about business. This is just another one of your martyr moves, except this time you're going to destroy people's livelihoods to make your point." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. I had bought the restaurant partly out of hurt and anger, but as I sat there listening to my daughter's pain, I realized that my motivations had already begun to evolve into something more complex. "You're right," I said, surprising both of us. "I don't know anything about restaurants. That's why I'm here to learn. From Marcos, from the staff, and yes, from you if you're willing to teach me." Delilah stared at me for another long moment, then bent to pick up her fallen clipboard. "I can't deal with this right now," she muttered. "I have a kitchen to run." She disappeared back through the swinging doors, leaving Marcos and me in awkward silence. I felt tears prick at my eyes but forced them back. This was my choice. My challenge to face. That went better than I expected, Marcos said dryly. Despite everything, I found myself laughing. "How is that possible?" She didn't quit on the spot. In Delilah's world, that counts as restraint. He refilled our coffee cups. "Give her time. She's processing." The rest of the morning was a whirlwind of introductions and information. Marcos walked me through the front of house operations, introducing me to the servers and hosts who would be arriving for the lunch shift. Most of them were polite but reserved, clearly waiting to see what kind of owner I would be. One server stood out from the rest. Harper Lynn was probably 25, with purple streaks in her blonde hair and an armful of eclectic tattoos. When Marcos introduced us, she looked me up and down with frank curiosity. "So you're the lady who bought the place," she said, extending a hand decorated with several silver rings. "I'm Harper. I've been serving tables here for 3 years." "Nice to meet you, Harper. I'm Evelyn." "Yeah, I know. Delilah's told us about you." She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "Look, I don't know what kind of family drama is going on here, but I want you to know that Delilah's good people. She's been through some stuff, and this kitchen is like her sanctuary. Just try not to mess that up for her, okay?" The direct honesty was refreshing after the morning's careful politeness. "I don't want to mess anything up for anyone," I said. "I want to learn how to make this place even better." Harper studied my face for a moment, then nodded. Okay, I can work with that. You want some advice? I'll take all the advice I can get. Don't try to change everything at once. People here are used to a certain way of doing things. Change gradually, and always explain why you're making changes. And maybe... She hesitated, then continued. Maybe don't expect Delilah to make this easy for you. She's stubborn as hell and doesn't trust easily. Sounds like she gets that from me, I admitted. Harper grinned. Now that I can believe. The lunch service was an education in controlled chaos. I positioned myself at a corner table where I could observe, without getting in the way. My notebook open as I tried to capture the intricate dance of service. Servers moved between tables with practiced efficiency. The kitchen expedited orders with military precision, and Marcos orchestrated it all from behind the bar, his eyes constantly scanning for problems or opportunities. I watched Delilah through the service window, her movements economical and sure as she plated dishes and called out orders. She was clearly in her element, commanding respect from the line cooks and maintaining the quality standards that made Maison Blanche special. Whatever personal issues we had, I couldn't deny her professional competence. During a brief lull between lunch and dinner prep, Harper appeared at my table with a plate of the restaurant's signature dish, pan-seared grouper with peach gastrique and bourbon-braised collard greens. Chef's orders, she said, setting the plate in front of me. She said if you're going to own the place, you need to know what we're serving. The food was extraordinary. Complex flavors balanced perfectly. Presentation that was elegant without being fussy. I could taste the skill and creativity that had gone into every element of the dish. When I looked up toward the kitchen, I caught Delilah watching me through the service window. Our eyes met for a brief moment before she turned away, but I thought I saw something soften in her expression. That afternoon, Marcos began teaching me the administrative side of the business. We reviewed vendor contracts, discussed staffing schedules, and examined the systems for inventory and cost control. It was overwhelming, but I found myself drawing on skills I'd developed as a teacher. Organization, attention to detail, the ability to juggle multiple priorities simultaneously. You're catching on faster than I expected, Marcos admitted as we worked through the weekly ordering process. Most new owners want to jump in and start making changes immediately. You're actually listening and learning. I spent 35 years in classrooms, I said, updating my notebook with information about our wine distributor. I learned that the students often know more than the teacher about what really works. I figure the same principle applies here. As the dinner service began, I retreated to my observation post, watching the evening rhythm unfold. The energy was different from lunch, more intense, more sophisticated. The dining room filled with couples celebrating anniversaries, business, groups entertaining clients, families marking special occasions. These were people who had chosen Maison Blanche for important moments in their lives, and I felt the weight of responsibility to preserve what made those moments special. Near the end of service, as I was preparing to leave, Harper approached my table again. "So," she said, sliding into the chair across from me, "how was your first day as a restaurant owner?" I closed my notebook and considered the question. "Terrifying," I said honestly. "Exhilarating, humbling, all at the same time. That sounds about right. Can I ask you something?" "Of course. What's your endgame here? I mean, really. Are you planning to learn the business and run it yourself, or is this some elaborate way to connect with your daughter?" The question was perceptive and direct, very much in keeping with Harper's personality. I found myself giving her an equally direct answer. I honestly don't know, I admitted. Maybe both, maybe neither. 3 weeks ago, I was a retired teacher living quietly, in a big empty house. Now I own a restaurant and have no idea what I'm doing. I'm making it up as I go along. Harper nodded approvingly. I like that answer. It's honest. Delilah doesn't trust people who pretend to have all the answers. As I drove home that night, Franklin's reading glasses on the passenger seat beside me, I reflected on the day's events. I'd survived my first day as a restaurant owner. I'd met my staff, begun to understand the business, and even managed a brief, tense encounter with Delilah without either of us storming out. It was a start. A small, tentative, terrifying start, but a start nonetheless. Back in my study, I wrote a new entry in my notebook. Day 1, survived. Learned that running a restaurant is like teaching, but with higher stakes and better food. Note to self, trust the process, trust the people who know what they're doing, and maybe, eventually, trust yourself. 3 weeks into my new life as a restaurant owner, I found myself settling into a rhythm I never could have imagined. My days began at 6 in the morning, reviewing the previous night's sales figures and planning the day ahead. By 7, I was at Maison Blanche, coffee in hand and notebook ready, absorbing everything Marcos and the staff were willing to teach me. The learning curve was steep, but I discovered that many of the skills I developed as a teacher translated surprisingly well to restaurant management, reading people, anticipating problems, mediating conflicts, motivating teams. These were all familiar challenges, just in a different setting. The main difference was the pace. In teaching, you could take time to think through a problem. In restaurants, decisions had to be made instantly, often with incomplete information and high stakes. I was getting better at it, though. Yesterday, when our produce vendor delivered wilted lettuce and overripe tomatoes, I didn't panic or defer to Marcos. Instead, I called the supplier directly, negotiated a replacement delivery, and found a backup vendor for future emergencies. Small victories, but they were adding up. What hadn't improved was my relationship with Delilah. We'd managed a careful, professional détente. She ran the kitchen with her usual competence. I stayed out of her way, and we communicated through Marcos when necessary. But the hurt and anger were still there, simmering just beneath the surface of our polite interactions. It was Harper who finally forced the issue. On a Thursday afternoon, during the quiet period between lunch and dinner service, she cornered me in the office I'd set up in what used to be a storage room. "Okay, this has gone on long enough," she announced, dropping into the chair across from my desk. "You and Delilah are driving everyone crazy with this passive-aggressive dance you're doing." I looked up from the inventory spreadsheet I'd been struggling with. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you don't. Yesterday, she asked me to tell you that the walk-in cooler needs maintenance. You asked me to tell her that you'd already scheduled it. You're both adults having a conversation through a 25-year-old server. It's ridiculous." Harper was right, of course, but I wasn't sure how to fix it. She made it clear she doesn't want to talk to me. She made it clear she's hurt and confused and doesn't know how to process what you've done. There's a difference. Harper leaned forward, her expression serious. "Look, I don't know the whole story between you two, but I can see that you love each other, and love without communication is just two people suffering in the same space." That evening, I stayed late to review the week's financials. The numbers were actually encouraging. Our food costs were down slightly, and customer satisfaction scores were up. Whatever personal drama was playing out behind the scenes, It wasn't affecting the restaurant's performance. I was so absorbed in the spreadsheets that I didn't notice Delilah enter the dining room until she spoke. "You're still here." I looked, up to find her standing near my table, still in her chef's whites, but with her hair down, looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. "Just finishing up," I said, closing my laptop. "The numbers are looking good this week." She nodded, then seemed to struggle with something. Finally, she pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. The first time we'd been alone together since that awful dinner 3 weeks ago. "I keep waiting for you to fire me," she said without preamble. The admission surprised me. "Why would I fire you? You're the best chef this restaurant has ever had. Because I was cruel to you. Because I embarrassed you in front of customers. Because I said things." She trailed off, staring at her hands. I studied my daughter's face, really looked at her, and saw exhaustion and regret alongside the familiar defiance. When had she gotten so thin? When had those shadows appeared under her eyes? "Delilah," I said gently, "I didn't buy this restaurant to punish you." "Then why?" Her voice was almost a whisper. "Why would you do something so completely out of character? The mother I know doesn't make impulsive decisions. She doesn't take risks. She doesn't—" She gestured around the restaurant. "She doesn't do this." It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself every day since signing the papers. I reached into my purse and pulled out the family photo I'd been carrying since Franklin's death. The 3 of us at Christmas about 10 years ago, all smiles and hope for the future. "Do you remember this?" I asked, sliding the photo across the table. Delilah picked it up, her expression softening. "Christmas 2014. Daddy had just finished his book manuscript. We were so proud of him. He never got to see it published," I said. "The heart attack came 6 months later." "But you know what he told me that Christmas? He said his biggest regret wasn't anything he'd done. It was the things he'd never tried, the dreams he'd been too careful to chase." Delilah's eyes were fixed, on the photo, but I could see tears gathering. "That night you told me I didn't deserve a place at the table," I continued. "I went home and sat in your father's study, holding his reading glasses and thinking about all the dreams I had set aside. The cafe I never opened, the writing I never pursued, the adventures I never took, because they seemed too risky or impractical." I paused, remembering that pivotal moment of decision. Your father made me promise, years ago, that if anything happened to him, I wouldn't let fear stop me from becoming who I was meant to be. I'd forgotten that promise until you reminded me that I'd never fought for anything in my life. Delilah looked up then, her eyes red-rimmed but focused. "So, you bought a restaurant?" "I bought a restaurant," I confirmed. "Not to hurt you, but to honor him, and maybe to prove to myself that I could be brave, for once." We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of years of misunderstanding settling between us. Finally, Delilah spoke. "I was so angry when Daddy died," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not just sad, angry, at him for leaving, at the doctors for not saving him, at God for letting it happen, but mostly at you." "At me? Because you seemed so calm, so accepting, like you'd already made peace with losing him before he was even gone." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I wanted you to fight, to rage, to demand that the universe give us more time. Instead, you just took care of everything, arranged the funeral, settled his affairs, went back to your quiet life like nothing had changed." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I'd thought I was being strong for her, handling the practical details so she could grieve freely. Instead, I'd appeared cold and detached at the moment she needed me to be fully present in my own pain. I was devastated, I said, my own tears flowing now. But I'd been preparing for that moment for 30 years. Your father's heart condition was always there, always threatening. I learned to compartmentalize, to focus on what needed to be done, instead of what I was feeling. But I didn't know that, Delilah said. All I saw was my mother being practical when I wanted her to be human. I reached across the table and took her hand, the first physical contact we'd had in years. Her fingers were rough from kitchen work, but warm and familiar. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry I didn't show you my grief. I'm sorry I seemed to accept his death so easily. I'm sorry for all the ways I failed you when you needed me most." Delilah squeezed my hand, her tears falling freely now. "I'm sorry, too, for what I said that night, for pushing you away, for being so angry for so long that I forgot how to just love you." We sat there crying together, years of accumulated hurt beginning to dissolve in the honest acknowledgement of our mutual failures. It wasn't forgiveness yet. We both had too much work to do for that. But it was a beginning. "So what happens now?" Delilah asked eventually. "Now we figure out how to be a family again," I said, "and maybe how to run a restaurant together." She smiled through her tears, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in years. "You know you're completely insane for buying this place, right? The restaurant business is brutal. Most new owners fail within the first year. So I've been told, repeatedly." I smiled back. Good thing I have an excellent chef to help me beat the odds. Over the following weeks, our relationship began to shift in small, tentative ways. Delilah started joining me for coffee in the mornings, sharing insights about the kitchen operations and offering suggestions for improvements. I began spending more time in the kitchen during service, learning to read the controlled chaos of professional cooking and understanding the artistry behind what looked like mere efficiency. The breakthrough came during a particularly busy Saturday night. We were slammed, every table full, a wait list of 30 people, and 2 servers out sick with the flu. In the middle of the rush, our dishwasher cut his hand badly enough to require stitches, leaving us dangerously behind on clean plates and utensils. Without thinking, I rolled up my sleeves and stepped into his place at the dish pit. It was hot, wet, physically demanding work that left me soaked and exhausted. But I kept up with the pace, working alongside Harper and one of the line cooks to keep clean dishes flowing to the kitchen. At the end of the night, as we were cleaning up, Delilah appeared beside me at the dish station. "I've never seen an owner jump in like that," she said quietly. "I've never owned a restaurant before," I replied, wringing out a wet towel. "I'm making it up as I go along." "You did good tonight, Mama." The endearment slipped out naturally, and we both noticed it. Daddy would have been proud. I felt my eyes well up, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. "Thank you for saying that. I mean it. You've been different since you bought this place. More present, more yourself, if that makes sense." It did make sense. I was discovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. The part that could make quick decisions under pressure, that could command respect through competence rather than just kindness, that could take risks and handle the consequences. I was still the same woman who'd spent decades nurturing others, but I was also becoming someone new. The changes weren't just internal. The restaurant was thriving under my ownership. with customer satisfaction at an all-time high and profits exceeding projections. Marcos had started deferring to my judgment on operational decisions, and the staff had begun approaching me directly with concerns and suggestions. Even Harper, who'd been skeptical of my motives from the beginning, had become a genuine ally and friend. But the most important change was in my relationship with Delilah. We were talking again. Really talking. Not just exchanging pleasantries or professional updates. She'd started sharing stories about her culinary adventures, her dreams of eventually opening her own place, her fears about never being good enough to live up to her own expectations. In return, I found myself opening up about my own dreams and regrets, the compromises I'd made, and the woman I was still becoming. One evening, as we were reviewing the next week's menu, Delilah surprised me with a question. "What would you have called your cafe, the one you dreamed about opening?" I smiled, remembering the young woman I'd once been. "The reading room." I wanted it to be a place where people could come for good food and great conversation, where ideas could flourish over coffee and homemade pastries. Delilah nodded thoughtfully. "I like that. It sounds like you." "What about your dream restaurant?" I asked. "What would that look like?" Her eyes lit up with excitement. Farm-to-table Southern. Fusion. Traditional techniques with modern interpretations. Local ingredients, seasonal menus. Everything made from scratch. She paused, then added more quietly. "I'd call it Carter's Table." "Carter's Table?" I repeated, feeling a warm glow of pride and possibility. "I love it." As I drove home that night, the family photo on my passenger seat alongside Franklin's reading glasses, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few short months. I'd set out to prove that I could fight for something, to reclaim my dignity after a moment of public humiliation. Instead, I'd found something much more valuable, a path back to my daughter and a version of myself I'd never known existed. The journey wasn't over. There were still difficult conversations ahead, still business challenges to navigate, still years of damaged relationship to repair. But for the first time since Franklin's death, I felt hopeful about the future. I'd finally learned how to set my own table, and I was discovering that there was room for everyone I loved to join me there. 2 months after our tearful reconciliation, I was finally feeling confident about my new life. The restaurant was turning a healthy profit. Delilah and I were rebuilding our relationship one conversation at a time, and I'd even started dating again. Coffee with a retired librarian named Robert, who shared my love of literature and seemed genuinely impressed by my late-in-life career change. That sense of progress made what I discovered in Franklin's study all the more shocking. I'd been avoiding a thorough cleaning of his office, content to dust around his papers and books without disturbing the careful arrangement he'd left behind. But spring cleaning season had arrived, and I'd finally decided it was time to sort through his research materials and donate what the local historical society might find useful. It was while boxing up his Civil War manuscripts that I found the journal. It was wedged between 2 thick volumes on Reconstruction, so well hidden that I might never have discovered it if I hadn't been removing every book from the shelves. The journal itself was unremarkable, a simple leather-bound notebook of the type Franklin had always preferred for his research. But when I opened it, expecting to find more historical notes, I found something entirely different. The first entry was dated just 3 months after Delilah's birth, written in Franklin's careful handwriting. "Evelyn thinks I don't notice how she looks at other people's lives sometimes. The women who kept their careers, who travel, who seem to have it all. She gave up so much for us, for me and my weak heart, and now for Delilah. I see her sometimes staring out the kitchen window while she does dishes, and I know she's dreaming of the cafe she wanted to open. The reading room, she called it. Such a perfect name for such a perfect dream. My hands trembled as I turned the page. There were dozens of entries spanning nearly 30 years, all focused on me. My sacrifices, my unspoken dreams, my quiet disappointments that I thought I'd hidden so well. Today, Evelyn suggested we take a trip to Charleston for our anniversary. I could see the longing in her eyes when she mentioned the little restaurant district there. The way she studied the cafe owners like she was memorizing their secrets. I had to say no because of the doctor's appointment I can't reschedule. But I saw something dim in her face when I explained. She smiled and said she understood, but I know I'm stealing pieces of her life every time my condition limits our options. I sank into Franklin's reading chair, the journal clutched against my chest. All these years I'd thought I was protecting him from my own regrets, making sure he never felt guilty about the dreams I'd set aside. Instead, he'd seen everything, every wistful glance, every swallowed disappointment, every moment when I'd chosen his needs over my own desires. The entries continued, becoming more urgent as the years passed. Delilah announced today that she wants to go to culinary school. Evelyn's first reaction was pure joy. I could see it in her eyes before the practical concerns kicked in. For just a moment, she was the young woman who dreamed of opening her own cafe, living vicariously through our daughter's courage. Then, she started worrying about money and stability and all the reasons dreams are dangerous. I wanted to shake her and tell her to encourage Delilah's passion, to live her own dreams through our daughter, if she can't chase them herself. But I stayed quiet, as always, letting Evelyn be the practical one while I get to be the supportive parent. The journal revealed layers of guilt and frustration I'd never suspected Franklin carried. He'd known about my cafe dream all along, had watched me sacrifice it year after year, and had felt powerless to change the dynamic we'd created. Worse, he'd recognized how my own unfulfilled ambitions had shaped my relationship with Delilah, making me the voice of caution instead of encouragement. But it was the final entries, written in the months before his death, that truly shattered my understanding of our family's story. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months, possibly a year if I'm lucky. I haven't told Evelyn yet. Can't bring myself to steal what's left of her hope. But I'm terrified of what will happen to her when I'm gone. She's built her whole identity around taking care of me, around being the practical one who makes sacrifices for the family. What will she be when there's no one left to sacrifice for? I need to find a way to tell her that she deserves more, that she's always deserved more. The cafe, the travel, the adventures she never allowed herself. They're still possible. But how do you tell the woman who's spent 30 years putting everyone else first that it's finally time to be selfish? Delilah is angry with me for being sick, angry with Evelyn for being so accepting of my illness. She doesn't understand that her mother's strength isn't acceptance. It's the choice to love fully even when love means loss. But maybe that's my fault, too. Maybe I let Evelyn sacrifice so much that our daughter never learned to recognize love that asks for nothing in return. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before his heart attack. I made Evelyn promise today that if anything happens to me, she won't let fear stop her from becoming who she's meant to be. She laughed it off, kissed me, told me nothing was going to happen. But I saw something flicker in her eyes. Hope. Maybe. Or possibility. I pray that when the time comes, she'll remember that promise. I pray she'll finally fight for herself the way she's always fought for everyone else. I closed the journal and sat in Franklin's chair for a long time, tears streaming down my face as I processed what I'd discovered. My husband had seen me more, clearly than I'd seen myself. He'd understood the cost of my choices, had carried guilt about my sacrifices that matched my own guilt about his illness. Most devastating of all, he'd recognized how my own unfulfilled dreams had affected my relationship with Delilah, long before I'd been willing to acknowledge it myself. The journal also explained something that had puzzled me about Delilah's reaction to Franklin's death. She hadn't just been grieving her father. She'd been angry at both of us for the unspoken dynamics that had shaped our family. She'd seen her parents as trapped in roles that diminished them both. Franklin as the fragile dreamer who couldn't pursue his own ambitions. Me as the practical caretaker who'd forgotten how to want anything for myself. But there was something else in those pages. Evidence of a love so deep and observant that it had noticed every sacrifice, remembered every dream and hoped for possibilities even in the face of death. Franklin had loved me enough to see who I could become, even when I'd forgotten that person existed. That evening I called Delilah and asked her to come to the house. When she arrived, still in her chef's whites from the dinner service, I handed her the journal without explanation. "I found this today," I said simply. "I think you need to read it." Delilah settled into the couch and began reading while I made tea in the kitchen, giving her privacy to process Franklin's words. I could hear her crying before I'd finished steeping the leaves, soft sobs that gradually grew stronger as she worked through the entries. When I returned with the tea, she was clutching the journal the same way I had, her face streaked with tears. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew everything." "Yes," I said, settling beside her on the couch. "He saw things I thought I was hiding." "He understood why I was so angry," she continued, her voice breaking. "He knew that I wasn't just mad about him dying. I was mad about all the ways we were all pretending to be happy with lives that were too small for us." We sat together in the living room where Franklin had spent so many evenings reading, surrounded by the books and memories of a man who'd loved us enough to see our truths, even when we couldn't see them ourselves. The journal had rewritten our family's story, revealing depths of understanding and love that made our recent conflicts seem both more tragic and more hopeful. "What do we do with this?" Delilah asked finally. I thought about Franklin's final wish, his hope that I would finally fight for myself. I thought about the restaurant I'd bought in a moment of desperate courage, and how that impulsive decision had already changed both our lives in ways I was still discovering. "We honor it," I said. "We become the people he believed we could be. We stop letting fear make our decisions for us." Delilah nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Carter's table," she said quietly. "What?" "That restaurant I want to open someday. Carter's table. Maybe it doesn't have to be someday. Maybe it could be soon." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just the talented chef she'd become, but the dreamer she'd always been. The woman Franklin had believed deserved to chase her own ambitious vision. "Tell me more," I said, settling back into the couch. "Tell me everything." The weeks following our discovery of Franklin's journal transformed everything between Delilah and me. But they also created a new kind of tension, the electric anticipation of two people who finally decided to stop playing it safe. Delilah's vision for Carter's table consumed our conversations. She wanted to create something that honored Southern culinary traditions while pushing boundaries, a place where locally sourced ingredients would be transformed into dishes that told the story of our region's complex history. We spent hours at Maison Blanche after closing, sketching restaurant layouts on napkins and debating everything from menu concepts to the perfect shade of paint for the dining room walls. I wanted to feel like coming to dinner at someone's home, she explained one night, her eyes bright with excitement. But someone who happens to be an exceptional cook with impeccable taste, warm but sophisticated, familiar but surprising. The more she talked, the more I could see it. Not just the restaurant she was describing, but the woman she was becoming as she articulated her dreams. This was the daughter Franklin had seen, the one who'd inherited my practicality but combined it with his intellectual curiosity and her own artistic vision. But bringing Carter's Table to life would require more than dreams and late-night planning sessions. It would require the kind of capital investment that could either secure our future or destroy everything we'd built. "The space I want is available," Delilah announced one morning, spreading photographs across my desk. "It's that old Victorian house on Abercorn Street, the one with the wraparound porch and the carriage house in back. The main floor could be the dining room. The carriage house could be a private event space. And there's already a commercial kitchen from when it was a catering business." I studied the photos, my heart racing with recognition. It was exactly the kind of place I'd dreamed of for the reading room all those years ago. Elegant but welcoming, with the kind of character you can't build into a new construction. "What are they asking?" I inquired, though I was already mentally calculating whether we could make the numbers work. $750,000 for the building, plus another $200,000 minimum to renovate and equip it properly. And that's being conservative. Nearly $1 million. The number sat between us like a challenge, simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. It was more money than I'd ever contemplated spending on anything except our house. It represented every dollar of financial security I'd built over decades of careful saving and conservative investing. It was also exactly the kind of risk Franklin had hoped I'd finally be brave enough to take. "We'd need investors," I said, my practical teaching mind automatically shifting into problem-solving mode. "Or partners, or we could mortgage Maison Blanche," Delilah said quietly. "It's worth enough to secure a loan for the full amount." Suggestion hung in the air between us, loaded with implications we both understood. Mortgaging Maison Blanche would mean risking everything we'd built over the past 6 months. If Carter's Table failed, we could lose both restaurants, leaving us with nothing but debt and shattered dreams. "That's a hell of a gamble," I said finally. "Yeah," Delilah agreed. "But it's our gamble, together." That night, I sat in Franklin's study with his journal open beside me, reading his entries about my long-buried cafe dreams. I'd found something else while cleaning out his desk, a manila folder labeled "For Evelyn" in his careful handwriting. Inside was the original menu I'd sketched out 30 years ago for the reading room, complete with my notes about creating a space where food and conversation could nourish both body and soul. Looking at those faded pages, I could see how Delilah's vision for Carter's Table was both completely her own and deeply connected to dreams I'd thought were lost forever. She was creating something that honored the past while embracing the future, something that would let both of us become the women we were meant to be. The next morning, I called Marcos into my office and showed him the Carter's Table plans. "So," he said after studying the photos and sketches, "you're thinking about opening a second restaurant." "We're thinking about it," I corrected. Delilah would be head chef and creative director. I'd handle the business side and front-of-house operations. Marcos leaned back in his chair, considering. "It's ambitious and risky. The restaurant failure rate for new concepts is brutal, especially in the first 2 years." "I know the statistics," I said, "but I also know we have something special here at Maison Blanche, The question is whether we can replicate that success with a completely different concept. What about this place? You can't run 2 restaurants simultaneously, especially not in the beginning. Carter's Table would need your full attention for at least the first year. I'd been wrestling with that same question for weeks. Maison Blanche had become more than just a business to me. It was the place where I'd discovered my own strength, where Delilah and I had found our way back to each other. The thought of stepping away, even temporarily, felt like abandoning something precious. What if you became a partner here? I asked Marcos. Not just manager, but part owner. You know this business better than anyone, and the staff trusts you completely. His eyebrows shot up in surprise. You're serious? Dead serious. You've been running this place for years anyway. Making it official would just acknowledge what's already true. Marcos was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him working through the implications. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'd want to make some changes. Update the wine list, refresh the menu seasonally, maybe expand our private dining options. All good ideas, I agreed. The place needs your vision, not just your management skills. That afternoon, Harper cornered me during the quiet period, before dinner service, sliding into the chair across from my desk with her usual directness. Word is you and Delilah are planning something big, she said without preamble. News travels fast around here. It's a restaurant. Of course it does. She studied my face carefully. You're scared. It wasn't a question, and I didn't try to deny it. Terrified, I admitted. We're talking about risking everything we've built here. Can I tell you something? Harper leaned forward, her expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. When you bought this place, I thought you were just some rich lady having a midlife crisis. I figured you'd get bored or overwhelmed and sell it within 6 months. And now? Now I think you're the bravest person I know. You took something that was dying and made it come alive again. Not just the restaurant, yourself too. And Delilah. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Whatever you decide about Carter's Table, it won't be because you're not capable of making it work. It'll be because you chose not to take the risk. And honestly, that doesn't seem like you anymore. That evening, Delilah and I walked through downtown Savannah, past the squares and historic homes that had witnessed centuries of dreams and disappointments, triumphs and failures. We ended up at the Victorian house on Abercorn Street, standing on the sidewalk as dusk painted the wraparound porch in golden light. I can see it, I said quietly. Tables on the porch for weekend brunch, herb gardens, in the backyard, maybe even a small stage in the carriage house for local musicians. Jazz on Sunday afternoons, Delilah added, her voice dreamy with possibility. Wine tastings featuring local vineyards, cooking classes in the winter when things are slower. We stood there imagining the life we could create in that beautiful, old house, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was young enough to believe anything was possible. Pure, uncomplicated hope. There's something I need to show you, I said, pulling out the folder I'd been carrying. I found this in your father's desk. Delilah examined my original menu for the reading room, her eyes widening as she took in the dishes I'd dreamed of serving 30 years ago. Many of them were surprisingly similar to concepts she'd been developing for Carter's Table. Proof that some dreams run deeper than conscious memory. Look at this, she said, pointing to an entry I'd written about wanting to create a place where stories are shared over food, where every meal becomes a conversation, and every conversation nourishes the soul. That's exactly what you're describing for Carter's Table, I realized. Different execution, same heart. Delilah folded the menu carefully, and handed it back to me. "Keep this," she said. "When we open Carter's table, I want to frame it and hang it in the entrance, so people know this dream has been 3 decades in the making." Walking home through the soft savannah evening, our decision felt both inevitable and terrifying. We were going to do it. Mortgage Maison Blanche, risk everything we'd built, and chase a dream that was equal parts my original vision and Delilah's artistic evolution. That night I called my sister Gwen and told her what we were planning. "Well, hell," she said after a long pause. "Franklin always said you had more steel in your spine than you let people see. Guess he was right." "I'm scared, Gwen. What if we fail? What if I'm risking Delilah's future on some crazy midlife fantasy?" "What if you succeed?" she countered. "What if you create something beautiful that lasts for generations? What if you finally become the woman Franklin always knew you could be?" As I hung up the phone, I realized that success or failure weren't really the point anymore. The point was finally having the courage to try, to risk everything for something that mattered more than security or comfort or other people's expectations. Tomorrow, Delilah and I would meet with the bank to discuss financing. We would look at renovation contractors and restaurant designers. We would take the first concrete steps toward making Carter's table a reality. Tonight I sat in Franklin's chair with his journal in my lap and his reading glasses on the table beside me, finally understanding what he'd meant about fighting for myself. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't protecting the people you care about from risk. It's having the courage to pursue dreams big enough to include them all. The meeting with the bank was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 8 months after that devastating dinner at Maison Blanche had changed everything. Delilah and I sat in the parking lot of First National Bank of Georgia, our business plan in a leather portfolio between us, both of us too nervous to speak. "We don't have to do this," I said finally, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. We did have to do this, not because anyone was forcing us, but because we'd reached that point in life where backing down would cost more than moving forward. "Yes, we do," Delilah replied, her voice steady despite the tension I could see in her shoulders. "We've come too far to turn back now." She was right. The past month had been a whirlwind of preparation. Financial projections, market analysis, architectural plans, contractor bids. We'd spent countless hours refining our vision for Carter's table, working with a restaurant designer who understood our goal of creating something that felt both timeless and innovative. The numbers were solid, the concept was strong, and we had the backing of Marcos and Harper, who'd agreed to help during the transition period. But sitting in that parking lot, looking at the imposing brick facade of the bank where I'd held a simple savings account for 30 years, I felt the weight of what we were asking for. $900,000 secured by everything we'd built at Maison Blanche. If Carter's table failed, we wouldn't just lose our new restaurant. We'd lose everything. "I keep thinking about what your father would say," I admitted to Delilah, whether he'd think we were being brave or just reckless. Delilah turned to look at me, her expression serious but calm. "Do you remember what he wrote in that journal entry about the difference between accepting things and choosing them?" I nodded. Franklin had written extensively about watching me make sacrifices that looked like acceptance, but were actually active choices born of love. He'd understood that there was courage in both kinds of decisions, the courage to accept what can't be changed and the courage to fight for what shouldn't be settled for. He'd say we're finally choosing instead of just accepting. Delilah continued, and I think he'd be proud of us for that. The bank meeting went better than I'd dared to hope. Our loan officer, a surprisingly young woman named Jennifer, who'd done her homework on both Maison Blanche's success and the local restaurant market, asked thoughtful questions about our projections and timeline. She seemed genuinely impressed by the thoroughness of our business plan and the strength of our track record. "I have to ask," she said as we neared the end of the presentation, "what makes you confident that Savannah can support another upscale restaurant? The market's pretty saturated." It was Delilah who answered, leaning forward with the passion I'd learned to recognize when she talked about food. "Because we're not just opening another upscale restaurant. We're creating a place that tells the story of this region through food, that honors where we come from while looking toward where we're going. There's nothing else like that in Savannah right now." Jennifer nodded, making notes on her tablet. "And Mrs. Carter, you're comfortable with using Maison Blanche as collateral? That's a significant risk." The question hung in the air between us, loaded with all the practical concerns I'd been wrestling with for weeks. I thought about Franklin's reading glasses sitting on my desk at home, about the journal entries where he'd wished for me to finally take a meaningful risk, about the young woman I'd once been who'd dreamed of opening a cafe called The Reading Room. "I'm comfortable with it," I said, surprised by how confident I sounded. "Because I believe in what we're creating, and I believe in my daughter's talent. Sometimes you have to risk what you have to get what you want." 3 weeks later, we got the approval. $900,000, secured by Maison Blanche, payable over 10 years at a surprisingly reasonable interest rate. The day we signed the final papers, Delilah and I went straight to the Victorian house on Abercorn Street and sat on the front porch steps, holding the keys to our future. "So this is really happening," she said, turning the ornate brass key over in her palm. "This is really happening," I confirmed, feeling a mixture of exhilaration and terror that was becoming familiar. The renovation process was both exciting and exhausting. We spent December and January working with contractors to transform the grand old house into a restaurant that would honor its history while serving our vision. The main floor became an elegant dining room with exposed brick walls and restored heart pine floors. The carriage house was converted into a private dining space, perfect for special events and wine tastings. We added a professional kitchen that was state-of-the-art but designed to feel like the heart of a home. But it was the details that really brought Carter's table to life. Delilah insisted on an herb garden in the backyard, with raised beds for basil, thyme, rosemary, and mint that would supply the kitchen year-round. I commissioned a local artist to create a mural that told the story of Southern food culture, from Native American agricultural traditions through the African diaspora influences that shaped our cuisine. We hunted through antique shops for mismatched chairs and vintage serving pieces that would make every table feel unique. The most meaningful addition was the framed menu from the reading room, which we hung in the entryway, exactly as Delilah had suggested. Below it, we added a small placard that read, "Some dreams wait 30 years to come true. They're worth the wait." Opening night was scheduled for the first Friday in March, and as the date approached, I found myself oscillating between confidence and panic. We'd hired an exceptional staff, including a sommelier who'd trained in France and a pastry chef who'd worked at some of the best restaurants in Charleston. The advance reviews from food writers who'd attended our preview events were glowing. Reservations were booked solid for the first month. But 3 days before opening, disaster struck. I was at Maison Blanche, reviewing the final details for the weekend's events, when Marcos appeared in my office doorway looking grim. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "The health inspector just left Carter's table. They found violations in the kitchen ventilation system and the walk-in cooler. Nothing major, but enough to delay the opening until everything's fixed." My heart sank. We'd already sent invitations for opening night, confirmed the staff schedules, ordered thousands of dollars worth of perishable ingredients. Delaying the opening would mean disappointing customers, wasting food, and potentially losing the momentum we'd built through weeks of publicity. "How long will the repairs take?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. "At least a week, maybe 2. And that's if we can get the contractors in immediately." I sat there for a moment, processing the implications. 2 weeks would push our opening back to late March, right into the busy spring tourist season, when every restaurant in Savannah would be competing for attention. We'd lose our carefully planned launch window and the advance publicity we'd generated. That evening, I drove to Carter's table and found Delilah in the kitchen, surrounded by contractors and repair estimates. She looked up when I entered, her face showing the same mixture of frustration and determination I was feeling. "The good news is it's all fixable," she said, gesturing at the papers scattered across the stainless steel counter. "The bad news is it's going to cost another $15,000 and set us back 2 weeks minimum." I looked around the kitchen that we'd spent months perfecting, at the custom-built stations, and the imported Italian pizza oven that Delilah had insisted was essential for her vision. Everything was so close to being perfect, and yet we couldn't serve a single customer until these final details were resolved. "What do you want to do?" I asked. Delilah was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on the counter where she'd spent countless hours planning menus and testing recipes. When she looked up, her eyes were blazing with the same fierce determination I'd seen in her father when he was facing down a particularly challenging research problem. "I want to fix it," she said. "All of it. I want to make this place everything we dreamed it could be, even if it takes longer than we planned. Even if it means spending more money we don't really have. Especially then, because this isn't just about opening a restaurant anymore, Mama. This is about proving to ourselves that we can see something through to the end, no matter what obstacles get thrown in our way." I felt tears prick at my eyes, but they were tears of pride rather than frustration. This was the daughter Franklin had seen in his journal entries, the one who'd inherited his intellectual curiosity and my stubborn persistence, but combined them with her own artistic vision and moral courage. "Then we fix it," I said. "All of it." The next 2 weeks were a blur of contractors, inspectors, and increasingly frantic preparation. We pushed the opening back to the last Friday in March, which meant competing with every other restaurant's spring promotions, but also gave us time to get everything exactly right. The additional repairs cost $18,000 instead of $15,000, which meant taking another small loan against my personal savings. But when the health inspector returned for the final check, Carter's table passed with flying colors. Opening night finally arrived on March 29th, 8 months to the day since I'd bought Maison Blanche. I stood in the kitchen of Carter's table, watching Delilah direct her team with the calm confidence of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. The dining room was full, the servers were moving with practiced efficiency, and the first dishes were going out to tables filled with food critics, local dignitaries, and friends who'd supported us through the entire journey. But it was the moment when Harper appeared in the kitchen doorway that really made the evening special. "Chef," she called to Delilah, "Table 12 wants to send compliments to the kitchen. They said the braised short ribs were the best they've ever had." Delilah smiled, but she didn't stop plating the next order. "Which table is 12? "The corner table by the window," the older couple celebrating their anniversary. I glanced through the pass-through window and felt my heart skip. Table 12 was occupied by a couple in their 70s, holding hands across the table while they shared a dessert and gazed into each other's eyes with the kind of deep contentment that comes from a lifetime of choosing each other over and over again. "That's exactly what I wanted," Delilah said softly, following my gaze. "To create a place where people make memories that last." The evening flew by in a blur of successful service and satisfied customers. By the time we served the last entree and poured the final glass of wine, I knew we'd achieved something special. Carter's Table wasn't just a restaurant. It was a place where food became a vehicle for connection, where every meal told a story worth remembering. After the last customer left and the staff finished cleaning, Delilah and I sat alone in the dining room with a bottle of champagne, exhausted but exhilarated. The framed menu from the reading room caught the candlelight from our table, and I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. "I have something for you," Delilah said, pulling a small leather journal from her chef's coat. "I've been working on this since we started planning Carter's Table." I opened the journal and found page after page of recipes written in Delilah's careful handwriting. But these weren't just any recipes. They were dishes that told the story of our family, from my grandmother's cornbread recipe to Franklin's favorite Sunday pot roast, to new creations that honored our heritage while pushing culinary boundaries. "Call it the Carter Family Cookbook," she explained. "Recipes that connect us to where we came from and where we're going. I thought maybe we could serve a few of these as specials, dishes that are only available here and tell the story of who we are." I turned through the pages, recognizing familiar flavors reimagined through Delilah's sophisticated technique. There was my mother's chicken and dumplings elevated with house-made pasta and locally sourced organic chicken. Franklin's beloved beef stew transformed into a wine-braised short rib that honored the comfort food inspiration while showcasing Delilah's culinary training. But it was the final entry that made me cry. Written in Delilah's neat handwriting was a recipe for Evelyn's Reading Room Sandwich, artisanal bread layered with locally sourced ham, aged cheddar, tomatoes from the restaurant's garden, and a homemade mustard that incorporated herbs from our backyard. Below the recipe, she'd written a note. "For the woman who taught me that love is an action verb, and that the best meals are the ones shared with people who see you exactly as you are." "It's perfect," I whispered, closing the journal and holding it against my chest. "All of it. Thank you." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two women who'd traveled a long road to arrive at this moment of shared triumph. The restaurant around us felt alive with possibility, filled with the promise of meals yet to be served and memories yet to be made. "You know what the best part is?" Delilah asked eventually. "What's that?" "Daddy was right. You did deserve a place. At the table. You just had to build your own table first." I thought about Franklin's journal entries, about his hope that I would finally fight for myself, about the reading glasses that still sat on my desk at home. He hadn't lived to see Carter's Table, but his influence was woven into every aspect of what we'd created. His love for both of us had given us the foundation we needed to find our way back to each other and forward into this new life we were building together. "We built it together," I corrected. "And now we get to see what happens next." As we walked out into the Savannah night, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete alignment between who I was and what I was doing. For the first time in my 62 years, I wasn't sacrificing parts of myself for other people's needs or settling for less than what I really wanted. I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do, with exactly the right people by my side. Carter's Table was more than a restaurant. It was proof that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be, and that the best dreams are the ones worth waiting for. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of Carter's table on a warm April morning, watching Delilah train our newest line cook, a culinary school graduate who reminded me of myself at her age, eager to please and terrified of making mistakes. The restaurant had not only survived its first year, but thrived beyond our wildest projections. We'd been featured in Southern Living magazine, earned a James Beard nomination for Outstanding New Restaurant, and built a waiting list that stretched 2 months out for weekend reservations. But success, I'd learned, was measured in more than reviews and revenue. It was measured in moments like this, watching my daughter share her knowledge with the next generation, seeing the confidence that had replaced the defensive anger she'd carried for so many years, witnessing the daily miracle of dreams made tangible through hard work and stubborn faith. Remember, Delilah was telling the young cook, the collard greens aren't just a side dish. They're telling the story of generations of women who turned humble ingredients into something that nourishes both body and soul. Treat them with respect. I smiled, recognizing echoes of the conversations we'd had about honoring culinary traditions while pushing creative boundaries. Delilah had become not just an exceptional chef, but a teacher, someone who understood that technique was meaningless without the deeper knowledge of why food matters to people. The morning prep was well underway when Harper appeared at my elbow, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression she got when everything was running smoothly. "The reservation book is completely full through June," she announced, settling beside me at the small table I'd claimed as my observation post. "And we've got 3 private events booked for the carriage house next month, including that anniversary party for the couple who were here opening night." I accepted the coffee gratefully, still amazed by how naturally Harper had transitioned from server to assistant manager. She'd turned out to have an intuitive understanding of hospitality that complemented her fierce loyalty to the staff. More than that, she'd become like a second daughter to me, someone who challenged my assumptions and reminded me to take risks, even when success might tempt me toward complacency. "Any word from the magazine people?" I asked, referring to the food writer from Bon Appetit, who'd been visiting southern restaurants for a feature on the region's culinary renaissance. "She'll be here next week. Marcos is handling the Maison Blanche visit, and we're doing the full tasting menu here on Thursday." Harper grinned. "Think we're ready?" I looked around the kitchen that had become as familiar as my own home, at the staff who'd grown from a collection of strangers into something resembling a large, slightly dysfunctional family, at my daughter, who was now explaining the proper way to julienne vegetables with the patience of someone who'd learned that teaching was its own form of love. "We're ready," I said with certainty. That afternoon, during the quiet hours between lunch and dinner service, I drove to Bonaventure Cemetery to visit Franklin's grave. It had become a monthly ritual, a way of staying connected to the man whose love had made everything else possible. I brought fresh flowers, daffodils this time because spring had always been his favorite season, and settled on the small bench I'd had installed facing his headstone. "You should see her, Franklin," I said, as I always did. "You should see the woman she's become. Strong and creative and generous, everything you knew she could be. She's teaching now, passing on what she's learned to the next generation of cooks. You'd be so proud." A warm breeze stirred the Spanish moss overhead, and I could almost hear his voice in the rustling leaves, telling me he'd been proud all along, that he'd just been waiting for us to see ourselves the way he'd always seen us. "Miss you," I continued, touching the reading glasses I still carried in my purse. "But I'm not lost anymore. I know who I am now, what I'm capable of. It just took me 63 years to figure it out. That evening, Carter's table was busy with the usual Friday night crowd, a mix of locals celebrating special occasions and tourists who'd heard about us through word of mouth or online reviews. I moved through the dining room, checking on tables and chatting with customers, still amazed by the life I'd built for myself. Near the end of service, I noticed a familiar face at table 12, the same corner table where that anniversary couple had sat on opening night. It was Delilah, still in her chef's whites, sitting across from a man I recognized as David, the sommelier she'd been quietly dating for the past few months. They were sharing dessert and talking with the easy intimacy of people who'd moved past the careful politeness of early romance into something deeper. As I watched, David reached across the table and took Delilah's hand, saying something that made her laugh with genuine delight. The sound carried across the dining room, and I felt my heart expand with gratitude for this moment, this life, this second chance at happiness that I'd never expected to receive. After the restaurant closed and the staff had gone home, Delilah and I sat in our usual spot, the table by the window where we'd shared so many post-service conversations over the past year. Between us was a small placard that hadn't been there that morning. Reserved. Carter family. "I had this made," she explained, running her fingers over the elegant lettering. "I thought maybe we could make it official. Every Friday night, after service, this table belongs to us. A time to check in with each other, celebrate the week's successes, talk through any problems." I picked up the placard, feeling the weight of what it represented. For so many years, I'd felt like I didn't deserve a place at any table. Not in my daughter's life, not in my own dreams, not in the larger conversation about what it meant to live fully and authentically. Now I had my own restaurant, my own table, my own weekly reservation for the life I'd chosen to create. "I love it," I said, propping the placard in its small stand. "Our table, our time, our new tradition." We sat together in the soft light of the dining room, two women who'd traveled, a long road to arrive at this place of mutual respect and shared purpose. Outside, Savannah was settling into its evening rhythm. Tourists heading back to their hotels, locals lingering over drinks on restaurant patios. The eternal dance of a city that understood the importance of taking time to savor life's pleasures. "What happens next?" Delilah asked, echoing the question I'd been pondering more frequently, as Carter's table's success exceeded our most optimistic projections. I thought about the conversation I'd had with a restaurant consultant about possibly franchising our concept, about the cookbook deal a publisher had offered, about the television show that wanted to feature our story of mother-daughter reconciliation through food. All possibilities, all tempting in their own ways. "I don't know," I admitted. "And for the first time in my life, I'm completely comfortable with not knowing. We'll figure it out as we go. Make decisions based on what feels right, rather than what seems safe." Delilah nodded, understanding what I meant. We'd both learned that the most important choices couldn't be planned in advance. They had to be made from a place of courage and authenticity, trusting that love and hard work would carry us through whatever challenges arose. As we prepared to leave, I took one last look around the dining room that had become the physical manifestation of dreams I'd carried for decades. Tomorrow we'd open the doors again, welcome new customers, create new memories, continue the daily miracle of transformation that happened whenever people gathered around a table to share food and stories. But tonight I was simply grateful for second chances, for daughters who forgive, for the kind of love that sees us exactly as we are and believes we can become even more. I'd finally learned to set my own table, And it turned out there was room for everyone I loved to join me there. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.